The last thing Isolde Vantris remembered from her old life was the sound of a car horn. The first thing she remembered from her new one was the sound of her own name, spoken like a curse, in a mirror she didn't recognize. The villainous Duchess, the maids whispered outside her door, not knowing she could hear every word. The one who dies after the wedding. She had read this novel. She had read it twice, actually, curled up on a rainy Tuesday with tea going cold beside her, rooting for the sweet heroine and despising the woman in the mirror now wearing her face. Isolde Vantris, proud, cruel, obsessed with a crown that was never meant for her. In 3 months, she marries the Emperor. In 4, according to 200 pages she remembered far too clearly, she is dragged out of her own wedding banquet in chains, accused of a crime she, the real Isolde, never committed, and executed at dawn while the man she married watches without blinking. That was the story. That was supposed to be the story. But nobody wrote what happens when the villainess wakes up and refuses to die on schedule. Nobody wrote what happens when she decides that if the Emperor's heart is the weapon aimed at her throat, then his heart is exactly what she intends to take first, not with poison, not with tears, but with the one thing no page of that novel ever gave her, a plan. Isolde sat at her vanity and stared at a face that was and was not her own. High cheekbones, a mouth built for sharp words, eyes the color of frozen wine. This was the face the novel had described as beautiful in the way a drawn blade is beautiful, admired and feared. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple, 3 months until the wedding. 4 until the executioner's platform. She had the plot memorized like scripture, and scripture, she decided, could be rewritten. The door opened without a knock. Cressida Vantris swept in, golden curls arranged with the precision of a girl who had spent her whole life being looked at and adored for it. Isolde's half-sister. In the novel, Cressida was the quiet, wronged girl who eventually married a kind marquis and lived happily while the true villainess rotted in a cell. Watching her now, Isolde noted the way Cressida's smile didn't reach her eyes when she looked at the wedding dress hanging in the corner. "Sister," Cressida said, voice like warm honey poured over glass, "the Emperor's messenger came again today. He says His Majesty wishes to move the wedding earlier. Isn't that wonderful?" Isolde's stomach dropped, but she kept her face still, the villainess's face, the one that didn't crack. "How much earlier?" 6 weeks. Cressida's eyes flicked just once to the small ring on Isolde's smallest finger, their late mother's ring, the only thing Isolde had left that felt like hers. "You should be thrilled, marrying Emperor Alaric Voss. Every woman in the Empire would kill for it. Some woman already has," Isolde thought, watching her sisters retreating back, "and I intend to find out who before she kills me too." She had 6 weeks less than she'd planned. 6 weeks less to turn a monster of a fiancé into an ally, 6 weeks less to find the stolen imperial ledger that the novel claimed she'd forged to frame herself for treason. A ledger she now understood, reading between every remembered line, that she never actually forged. Someone else did, someone who benefited when the real Isolde swung from a rope. That night she did not sleep. She sat with a candle and a blank sheet of paper and wrote, in handwriting steadier than her heart felt, 3 names: Cressida Vantris. Chancellor Dorian Wren, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, who, in the background of the novel's romance, always seemed to be standing just behind the throne watching. And a 3rd name she underlined twice: Emperor Alaric Voss himself, a man the novel described only through the heroine's love-struck eyes, never through his own, which meant Isolde knew almost nothing true about the man she was set to marry within 6 weeks. A man who, in 4 months, would watch her die and feel nothing. She would have to make him feel something else entirely. Whether that something was trust, respect, or fear didn't matter yet. What mattered was that a man who felt nothing could not be reasoned with, but a man who felt anything could be turned. The candle guttered low. Somewhere in the palace across the city, in a room she had never seen and a mind she had never touched, the Emperor of Aurelian was reading a report about his soon-to-be bride. Unstable, ambitious, dangerous. He set the report down and said only one thing to the man who'd brought it: "Watch her. If even a fraction of this is true, I want to know before the wedding, not after." Isolde didn't know it yet, but the countdown had already started on both sides of the palace walls, and neither of them realized they were about to become each other's only way to survive it. The Vantris estate library was the one place Cressida never bothered to enter, which made it the safest place in the house for Isolde to think. She'd spent the last week doing something the old Isolde never would have: reading, not novels, ledgers. Household expense records, correspondence logs, the mundane paper trail of a noble family, searching for the seam where the story the book told and the truth underneath it didn't match. She found it on the 9th night, in a stack of old correspondence her father hadn't bothered to lock away because he assumed his daughter couldn't read numbers, let alone hide behind them. A letter 3 years old in Cressida's careful handwriting, addressed not to a suitor or a friend, but to Chancellor Dorian Wren. The arrangement stands it read: when the elder daughter is disgraced, the Vantress seat passes to the legitimate line. See that it is done cleanly. Father need never know whose hand guided it. Isolde's fingers went cold around the paper. There it was, not a rumor, not a suspicion, but ink on paper, proof that her own sister and the Emperor's most powerful advisor had been planning her ruin since before she'd even been engaged. The novel had never shown this letter. The novel had shown a wronged, gentle Cressida weeping at Isolde's execution. Real people, Isolde was learning fast, were rarely as simple as the story made them look. Footsteps in the hall. Isolde folded the letter into her sleeve just as the library door creaked open and stiffened when she saw who stood there. Not a servant, not her father. A man in a dark traveling cloak, imperial insignia half hidden at his collar, studying her with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Lady Vantress, he said, voice low and unreadable, reading rather late for a bride. Isolde's heart slammed once hard before her training, years of surviving a family that hated her, plus one lifetime of watching how liars talked, took over. She rose, smoothed her skirts, and offered a smile with just enough ice in it to be believable. A bride who intends to know her own household before she's asked to leave it, who let you into my father's library, Lord Wren, he said. Dorian Wren, Chancellor to His Majesty. He watched her face for the flinch. She didn't give him one, though her pulse roared in her ears. So this is the man from the letter. This is the architect. I came on His Majesty's behalf. He wished a report on his future bride's character before the ceremony. I find myself curious now which report is true, the one in the palace files or the one standing in front of me. Tell your emperor, Isolde said, stepping close enough that he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes, refusing to let her voice shake. That reports written by men who have never spoken to me are worth exactly the paper they waste. If he wants the truth, he can ask me himself. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of line the novel's Villainess would have snapped in fury, except Isolde meant every word as a door left deliberately open, not a threat. Wren's mouth curved, something almost like respect flickering behind his eyes before it vanished. Careful, my lady, boldness is a fine performance until someone calls it. He inclined his head and left as quietly as he'd come, and only once his footsteps faded down the corridor did Isolde let herself sit, hands shaking now that no one could see. She had just looked her enemy in the eye and lied to his face without blinking, and worse, she suspected he knew it. Which meant the countdown to her death had just gotten shorter, unless she reached the Emperor first on her own terms before Wren could poison his ear against her. The invitation to the Imperial hunting grounds arrived 2 days later, sealed in gold wax bearing the crest of Aurelian. Not from the Emperor directly, from his mother, the Dowager Empress Selene, a woman the novel had mentioned exactly once, in a single line about disapproving of her son's chosen bride. Isolde read between that line now the way she'd learned to read between every line of her old life. If the Dowager disapproved loudly enough in the story, it meant she had power worth courting in reality. She arrived at the hunting lodge in a plain riding dress instead of the jewels Cressida had helpfully laid out for her, and found the Dowager Empress already waiting on the veranda, sharp-eyed and elegant, sipping tea like a woman who'd survived 40 years of court by underestimating no one. You didn't wear the diamonds, Selene observed. Diamonds don't ride horses well, your grace, Isolde said, and I intend to actually ride, not simply be seen sitting on one. Something shifted in the older woman's face, surprise carefully hidden. The girl before you sent 3 separate messages asking which color would flatter her most for my son's benefit. You are the first bride in a decade to arrive here caring more about the horse than the audience. She set down her cup. Tell me, Lady Vantress. Why do you want to marry my son? It was the question the novel's Isolde had never been asked, because the novel's Isolde had never needed to answer for herself. She was simply ambitious, a flat word doing all the story's work. The real Isolde, sitting across from a woman who could crown or condemn her with a single sentence to her son, understood this was the real test. I don't, Isolde said simply. The Dowager's eyebrows rose. I want to survive being married to him, which is a very different thing, your grace. Every account I've heard describes your son as cold, unreadable, and dangerous to cross. I'd rather know the truth of that before I stand at an altar with him than discover it after, when it's too late to protect myself. She met the older woman's eyes without flinching. I imagine you'd rather I be honest about that than pretend to love a man I've exchanged 4 sentences with. For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through the pines. Then the Dowager Empress laughed, a short, startled bark of a sound like she hadn't done it in years. 4 sentences, she repeated. God's help me, girl, that might be the most honest thing anyone has said in this palace in a decade. She rose, smoothing her skirts, gesturing for Isolde to follow toward the stables. Ride with me. If you can stay on a horse as well as you can hold your tongue steady under pressure, you may yet survive, my son. Whether you survive the rest of this court, she added, voice dropping, quiet enough that Isolde barely caught it, is a different question entirely, and one I suspect neither of us can answer yet. They rode until dusk, and by the time Isolde returned to the estate, exhausted and wind-burned, and more alive than she'd felt since waking into this body, she had gained something the novel never gave its villainess. An ally at the very top of the court watching her with open curiosity instead of practiced disdain. It wasn't enough. Ren was still out there, and Cressida's letter still burned like a coal in the lining of her jewelry box. But for the first time, Isolde let herself imagine a version of this story that didn't end with her neck in a noose, right before a servant came running with news that stopped her cold. The Emperor had moved up his own arrival. He would be at the Villainess estate by morning 3 weeks earlier than planned, and he was coming, the servant said, breathless, not for the wedding contract, my lady. He said he wished to meet you himself before anyone else could speak for you. Emperor Alaric Voss did not look like a man from a romance novel. That was Isolde's first unsteady thought as he stepped down from the imperial carriage into the gray morning light of the Villainess courtyard, not soft-eyed or gentle, but built like a man who'd spent more time at war councils than ballrooms. A thin scar cutting through one eyebrow, eyes the deep green of a forest that had never been friendly to travelers. The novel had described him as achingly handsome in exactly 1 sentence, and then spent 400 pages on how the heroine felt about him instead of who he actually was. Standing in front of him now, Isolde understood why nobody who wrote that book had ever really looked at him either. Lady Villainess. His voice was quieter than she expected, controlled the way a blade is controlled, not because it lacks danger, but because it knows exactly where that danger belongs. I understand you told my Chancellor that reports written by men who have never spoken to you are worthless. So Ren told him, of course he did. Isolde kept her spine straight, refusing to let the flush of nerves reach her face. I did, your majesty, I hold to it. Good. Something in his jaw eased almost imperceptibly. It's the first true thing anyone in this arrangement has said to me. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made Isolde feel like a ledger being read line by line for discrepancies. My mother sent a hawk last night. She said you rode well and lied badly, which she meant apparently as the highest compliment she has given a woman in years. Isolde felt something loosen in her chest, dangerously close to hope. Your mother is generous. My mother is many things. Generous has never been one I'd have used. A ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile crossed his mouth and vanished just as fast. I came to ask you one question myself, Lady Villainess, rather than let it pass through 6 other mouths first. Do you want this marriage? The novel's version of this scene, the version Isolde remembered with sick clarity, had the Villainess answering with a flattering lie about love and duty, a lie the Emperor saw through instantly and never forgave. Isolde chose differently. No, she said. I want to survive it. I think you may be the only person in this empire capable of helping me do that, your majesty, but only if we stop performing for each other and start being honest about what we actually need. He went very still. For one terrible second, Isolde thought she'd overplayed it, thought she'd just handed Ren the exact ammunition he needed to paint her as insolent and unfit for the crown. Then the Emperor did something the novel never once described him doing in 400 pages. He laughed, low and genuinely startled, the sound rough like it hadn't been used in a very long time. Every woman who has stood where you're standing has told me she loves me within the first 5 minutes, he said. You are the first to tell me you don't, and somehow it's the first time I've believed a single word out of any of their mouths. He extended a hand, not for a kiss, not for ceremony, but simply held it out, waiting. Walk with me, Lady Villainess. If we are going to survive being married to each other, I would like to know precisely what it is you think threatens you before my Chancellor decides the answer for both of us. Isolde placed her hand in his, and in that single unremarkable touch felt the story shift beneath her feet like ice cracking on a lake, the first true crack in a plot that was supposed to end with her execution. They walked the length of the garden in careful, measuring conversation, each testing the other's honesty inch by inch. And it was only as they reached the garden's far gate that Isolde caught from the corner of her eye a flash of gold hair ducking behind a hedge, Cressida, watching them with an expression that had nothing gentle left in it at all, and beside her unmistakably, the dark traveling cloak of Chancellor Dorian Wren. 3 days after the Emperor's visit, Cressida hosted a welcome home tea in the Villainess solarium. all lace and porcelain, and the particular brightness Cressida reserved for occasions she intended to use as weapons. Isolde had learned enough of her sister's rhythms by now to recognize the signs: the too eager smile, the servants dismissed early, the single, specific teacup set at Isolde's place that had come not from the household set but from Cressida's own private collection. Isolde did not drink from it. She'd learned in 9 sleepless nights of reading the household's expense ledgers that a specific tincture, bitter root, nearly tasteless when steeped in strong black tea, had been purchased twice in the last month by a maid who reported directly to Cressida. Not poison in the killing sense. Something subtler, a compound known to loosen the tongue, to blur judgment just enough to make a person say things they'd otherwise never say aloud, especially around people they'd been warned to distrust. She isn't trying to kill me yet, Isolde realized, watching Cressida's eyes track the teacup with barely restrained anticipation. She's trying to make me confess to something, or say something about the Emperor that can be repeated to ruin me before the wedding. You haven't touched your tea, Cressida said lightly, though her knuckles had gone pale around her own cup. I find I've lost my taste for anything from your private collection, sister. Isolde kept her voice light, almost teasing, watching the flicker of alarm cross Cressida's face before it smoothed away. Perhaps because the last gift you gave me from it was a wedding dress 2 sizes too small, and I've learned to be cautious of your generosity. You wound me, Cressida said, laughing, though the sound had an edge now. Truly, sister, ever since you returned from the Emperor's visit you've become so suspicious. It isn't attractive in a future Empress. Ever since I returned from the Emperor's visit. Isolde filed the phrase away like a blade sliding into a sheath. Cressida hadn't said ever since the engagement or ever since the wedding date moved. She'd said ever since the visit, which meant whatever plan she and Ren were running had accelerated the moment they saw the Emperor walk Isolde through that garden with his own hand extended. I've simply learned to pay closer attention, Isolde said, setting her own untouched cup down with deliberate care. You'd be amazed what a person notices once they stop assuming the people around them love them. She rose before Cressida could answer, smoothing her skirts, letting just enough of the old Villainess's cold command bleed into her voice to make her sister's smile falter completely. Do send my regards to Chancellor Ren, sister. I saw him in the garden hedge 3 days ago, and I'd hate for him to think I hadn't noticed him watching. She left the solarium without looking back, heart hammering, and did not breathe easy until she'd reached her own chambers and bolted the door. Her hands shook as she pulled the folded letter from its hiding place in the jewelry box lining Cressida's own handwriting, 3 years old, promising Isolde's ruin to a Chancellor of the Empire. She had proof. She had motive. What she did not have yet was anyone with the power to act on it before Ren and Cressida realized she knew and moved to silence her first. And somewhere beyond her chamber walls unseen. A second letter was already being sealed with wax, the deep crimson of the Chancellor's personal seal, addressed not to Cressida this time, but to a name Isolde had never once considered a threat: the Emperor's own younger brother, Prince Talon Voss. Next in line for the throne should anything at all, happen to remove Alaric from it first. Isolde requested an audience with Dowager Empress Selene the following week, ostensibly to discuss wedding preparations, and found the old woman waiting in her private study with 2 cups of tea already poured from the imperial kitchens. Isolde noted with relief, not from anywhere near Cressida's collection. You look like a woman carrying something heavier than wedding lace, Selene observed, watching Isolde over the rim of her cup. Isolde did not waste time with pleasantries. She had learned in her short weeks in this world that the Dowager Empress respected directness more than any courtly softness. She produced the letter and set it on the table between them. Selene read it twice. Her face, schooled by decades of court politics, gave away almost nothing, but Isolde caught the faint whitening around her knuckles, the way her jaw tightened at Ren's name. You understand what you're accusing, Selene said finally, voice very quiet. Not a jealous sister's petty cruelty, conspiracy against a noble line in collusion with a sitting imperial chancellor. If this is false, or if you cannot prove its origin beyond doubt, it will be you who is executed for slander before the ink on any wedding contract dries. I know, Isolde said, which is why I haven't taken it to the Emperor yet. Selene's eyebrows rose sharply. Why haven't you? Because a letter alone is a story with 1 witness, your grace, and 1 witness can always be discredited by 2 liars working together. Isolde leaned forward. I need to know what Ren gains from my ruin beyond simply doing my sister a favor. Men like him don't risk their position for someone else's inheritance out of kindness. There's something in this for him, something bigger than my sister's dowry. The Dowager Empress was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "There is a rumor," she said finally, so quietly Isolde had to lean in to catch it, "that predates you by years. That Chancellor Ren has spent a decade quietly building loyalty among certain lords who believe my son too young, too untested, and too unmarried to hold the throne securely against threats from the eastern territories. A discredited, disgraced empress, executed for treason within months of her wedding, would not merely embarrass my son. Her eyes met Isolde's hard and clear. It would destabilize the entire succession. It would give exactly the kind of men Ren has been courting the excuse they need to demand a regency council. And regency councils, Lady Villainess, tend to be run by chancellors." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Isolde's feet. This was never about Cressida's inheritance at all, or rather, it was, but only as the smallest piece of something enormous. Cressida wanted a title. Ren wanted a throne he could control from behind, and Isolde's execution was simply the lever he intended to pull to get it. "Does the Emperor know any of this?" Isolde asked. "He suspects. He has suspected for 2 years, which is precisely why he has never fully trusted Ren despite keeping him close. Better a snake watched than a snake hidden." Selene folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "But suspicion is not proof, child, any more than your letter alone is proof of the scale of what's coming. If you go to my son now with half a conspiracy, Ren will simply bury the rest of it before you can dig it out, and you will have spent your only weapon for nothing." She rose, moving to the window, watching the courtyard below where, unmistakably, Cressida stood in close, urgent conversation with a man in a dark cloak. "You need more than a letter, Isolde Villainess. You need to catch them in the act of building the very thing they intend to use to destroy you. And you have, at most, a matter of weeks before that wedding forces their hand." The Emperor summoned her 3 days later, not through Ren, not through any official channel, but through a note in his own hand delivered by a guard sworn to silence. "Meet me in the Eastern Archive at midnight. Come alone. Trust no one who tells you otherwise, including my own Chancellor." Isolde's pulse spiked reading it. Either this was the beginning of the alliance she'd been quietly building toward, or it was a trap dressed in the Emperor's handwriting, and there was no way to know which without walking into it. She went. The Eastern Archive was a maze of towering shelves and candlelight, and Alaric was waiting exactly where the note promised, alone, a single lantern throwing long shadows across a table stacked with documents. "I've had you watched," he said without preamble before she could speak. "Since the day my mother's hawk arrived, not out of distrust of you specifically, out of necessity. Every bride who has come before you arrived already compromised by someone at this court, usually without knowing it herself." He gestured to the documents. "What I found watching you was not what I expected." Isolde's stomach turned to ice. "What did you find?" "That my Chancellor has visited your family estate 4 times this month under invented pretenses. That your sister has met with 3 lords known to favor a regency council, always within a day of Ren's own visits to the same men. And that you," his green eyes fixed on her unreadable, "have spent every one of those weeks doing something no bride in this empire's history has bothered to do before you, building your own case. Quietly. Alone. Against people who would very much prefer you never learned to read a ledger at all." Isolde exhaled, some of the tension bleeding from her shoulders, not relief exactly, but the strange, dizzying sensation of being seen clearly for the first time since she'd woken in this body. "You already knew. I suspected. You confirmed it simply by walking through that door alone instead of running to warn your sister that I was watching her." He moved closer, closing some of the distance between them, voice dropping lower. "I need you to understand something, Lady Villainess, before this goes further. If we do this, if we move against Ren and your sister together, there is no undoing it. He will not simply retreat quietly. Men who have spent a decade building toward a throne do not fold because they are caught early, they accelerate." "I know," Isolde said steadily. "I've read enough of my sister's letters to understand exactly what kind of man doesn't fold." She met his eyes without flinching, the way she had in the courtyard, the way she had with his mother, refusing to let the fear in her chest bleed into her voice. "But I would rather move first on our terms than wait to be executed on his." Something shifted in Alaric's expression, not softness, not yet, but a kind of recognition, as though he were finally looking at a person instead of a political arrangement. "Then we move together," he said, "starting tonight." He slid one final document across the table toward her, a private ledger imperial seal at the corner, listing 6 names of Lords Ren had quietly courted over 2 years. "This is everything I have. It isn't enough alone. But paired with your letter, and whatever proof we can gather of an active plan rather than old intentions, it may be enough to end this before the wedding rather than after." He paused, studying her in the lantern light. You said in the garden that you wanted to survive this marriage rather than love it. I find myself curious now whether those two things are as separate as you seem to believe when you said them. Before Isolde could answer, the archive door creaked at the far end of the room, and both of them turned to find Prince Talon Voss standing in the doorway, a folded letter in his hand bearing a crimson wax seal. Isolde recognized instantly, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Brother, Talon said smoothly, stepping into the archive as though he hadn't just interrupted the most dangerous conversation of Isolde's short life in this world. I wasn't aware this room was in use. Alaric's face closed like a door slamming. Talon. It's late for a prince to be wandering the archives alone. It's later still for an emperor to be meeting his bride alone in the dark, Talon returned, easy and pleasant, though his eyes flicked once sharply to the ledger still open on the table between them. Isolde's blood went cold. He'd seen the names. He'd seen exactly what Alaric had gathered, and there was no way to know in this single unguarded moment whether the letter in Talon's hand was innocent correspondence or the very proof of collusion Selene had warned her about. I received something curious tonight, Talon continued, holding up the crimson-sealed letter from Chancellor Ren. He seems concerned that my brother's future empress may be, how did he phrase it, unduly influencing imperial decisions before the marriage has even been formalized. He suggested I might wish to raise the matter with the council. His gaze slid to Isolde, calculating. I confess I hadn't realized the concern had merit until I walked in on this exact scene. Isolde felt the trap closing before she fully understood its shape. Ren had anticipated this. He'd anticipated that Alaric might begin trusting her, might begin sharing information, and rather than wait to see if it happened, he'd already primed the Emperor's own brother to interpret it as exactly the kind of manipulation the novel's story had always accused her of. Ambitious, dangerous, manipulating the crown from the shadows. The label had been waiting for her all along, and Ren had simply been patient enough to let her walk into it herself. Then let me save the council the trouble of asking, Isolde said before Alaric could respond, before the moment could curdle into something neither of them could walk back. She stepped forward, chin lifted, meeting Prince Talon's calculating gaze without flinching. I came to this archive because your brother summoned me with proof that his own chancellor has spent 2 years courting lords for a regency council. He has no legal claim to a council that would only ever be necessary if something happened to remove your brother from the throne first. I would ask you, Your Highness, since you seem so concerned with propriety tonight, who benefits more from that outcome? A bride with no allies and no army, sitting alone in a room with documents she didn't write? Or a chancellor who has spent a decade quietly building exactly the kind of loyalty a regency requires? The silence that followed stretched long enough that Isolde could hear her own pulse in her ears. Talon's easy, pleasant expression flickered, just once, just enough for Isolde to see something calculating shift behind it. Weighing costs, weighing risk, deciding in real time which side of this conversation was more dangerous to be caught standing against. That, he said finally, voice quieter than before, is a very specific accusation to make at midnight, Lady Vantress. It's the truth, Alaric said, moving to stand beside her, not in front of her, not shielding her like a fragile thing, but beside her as an equal. And Isolde felt something in her chest crack open at the simple fact of it. And you're going to help us prove it, Talon, one way or another. Because if Ren succeeds in painting my future wife as a manipulative traitor before this wedding, the next accusation he levels won't stop at her. It will come for you next, the moment he decides you're no longer useful to him either. Talon's jaw tightened, and for the first time all night, Isolde watched the calculating prince actually hesitate. Right before a distant bell began tolling through the palace, 3 sharp peals that made all 3 of them go still. The fire alarm. Coming, unmistakably, from the direction of the Vantress estate archives, where every remaining piece of evidence Isolde had spent weeks gathering sat locked in a single unguarded drawer. They reached the Vantress estate to find the West Wing archive already half consumed by flame servants scrambling with buckets. And Cressida standing in the courtyard in a nightgown weeping beautifully into a handkerchief for an audience of exactly the Lords Ren had spent 2 years courting. Every one of them conveniently present for a family visit that Isolde now understood had been arranged for this precise night. She said it herself, Alaric said grimly, watching the performance with cold, assessing eyes. Or had it said, either way, she's about to claim you did it, destroying your own family's records rather than let anyone see what's in them. He was right. The moment Isolde stepped from the carriage, Cressida's head snapped up, tear-streaked and perfectly timed. Sister, you returned, oh, thank the gods, I feared you'd fled after what you did, her voice carried deliberately to every watching lord. The archive. Our father's private ledgers, 3 generations of Vantress records gone, all of it, and the last person seen near that wing tonight was Chancellor Wren, Isolde said, loud and clear, cutting through her sister's rehearsed grief before it could finish landing. Every head in the courtyard turned. I have a letter written in your own hand 3 years ago, sister, promising my ruin to the Chancellor in exchange for the Vantress seat. I imagine that letter is precisely what burned tonight in an attempt to silence it, except I removed it from that archive 2 weeks ago, the moment I realized this exact scene was coming. Gasps rippled through the assembled lords. Cressida's composure cracked for the first time all night, real fear flashing raw across her face before she caught it. That's a fabrication, she's lying, ask anyone, I would never. Then you won't mind, Alaric said, voice carrying the full, cold weight of imperial authority for the first time Isolde had heard him use it. If my chancellor is questioned alongside your sister before this assembled council about his own correspondence regarding the Vantress inheritance. Chancellor Wren. He turned and Isolde watched, breath caught, as Dorian Wren stepped forward from among the gathered lords. He'd been there the whole time, watching, exactly as Selene had warned he would be, patient even now. Explain to me why a fire conveniently destroyed the one archive containing evidence of your correspondence, on the exact night my future bride happened to be summoned away from the estate. For the first time since Isolde had met him, something in Wren's careful composure faltered. Your Majesty, this is a misunderstanding born of a desperate woman's fear of her own execution. I have the ledger, Alaric said, producing it, the same one from the archive, 6 names listed in his own hand. 6 lords courted over 2 years for a council that only becomes necessary if something removes me from this throne. Shall I read the names aloud here, Chancellor, in front of the men whose names appear on it? Or would you prefer to explain first why a decade of quiet loyalty building suddenly required my bride's public execution to activate? The courtyard had gone utterly silent. Isolde watched the exact moment Wren's calculations shifted, watched him realize in real time that the trap he'd spent years building had just been turned back on him with his own co-conspirators standing as witnesses to his exposure. He straightened, and for one terrible moment Isolde thought he might simply deny everything and dare them to prove it in a formal trial that could drag on for months, giving him time to bury every remaining thread of evidence. Instead, Wren did something far more dangerous. He smiled thin, resigned, and utterly without fear, and said, quiet enough that only those closest could hear. 2 years is a long time to build something, Your Majesty. Long enough to ensure that even if I fall tonight, the men I've courted don't simply disappear with me. His eyes slid deliberately to Isolde. Ask your bride how confident she is that every lord in this courtyard is here purely as a witness, rather than as a contingency I arranged months ago for exactly this outcome. For one long, breathless moment, nothing in the courtyard moved. 6 lords stood among the gathered crowd, the 6 names from Alaric's ledger, and Isolde understood with sick clarity that Wren's final gambit was not to deny his guilt, but to reveal publicly that he had allies present willing to act rather than watch him fall alone. It was the kind of moment the old novel would have ended badly for her. Chaos, violence, a villainess caught between forces bigger than herself with no way out. But Isolde was not the villainess the novel had written. She had spent weeks doing the one thing that story never gave her credit for, paying attention. And she had noticed, 3 days earlier, exactly which of Wren's 6 courted lords had begun quietly distancing himself. The moment rumors of the Emperor's suspicions started circulating, Lord Ashford Marrow, standing now at the courtyard's edge, sweating despite the cold night air. Lord Marrow, Isolde said, turning to him directly before Wren could finish his threat, before fear could take root in the crowd and tip the moment toward violence. You visited the Dowager Empress privately last week, did you not? To ask what might happen to a man's family holdings if he were found to have supported a conspiracy he'd since grown to regret. She watched the color drain from his face as every eye in the courtyard turned to him instead of her. I don't believe you're here tonight as anyone's contingency, my lord. I believe you're here because you were promised protection if the truth came out before you were forced to act against a throne you never truly wished to betray. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Isolde had ever heard. Then Lord Marrow, visibly trembling, stepped forward and bowed low before the Emperor. Your Majesty, I have documents, correspondence, dates, names, everything Chancellor Wren used to secure our silence and our support. I kept them the day I understood what he truly intended in case I ever found the courage to use them. His eyes flicked, briefly, gratefully, toward Isolde. I did not expect that courage would come from the woman he intended to destroy. It broke Wren's final gambit instantly. The remaining 5 lords, seeing one of their own defect in front of the entire assembled court, scrambled just as quickly to distance themselves, each producing their own scraps of proof, each eager to prove they had been coerced rather than willing. Within the hour, Imperial guards had Ren in custody. His decade of careful maneuvering collapsed not by force or violence, but by the simple, patient work of a woman who had refused to be only what a story once decided she should be. Cressida, stripped of her rehearsed tears the moment her co-conspirator was led away in chains, was escorted to a separate holding chamber, weeping now for entirely different, far less sympathetic reasons. Isolde stood in the courtyard long after the crowd dispersed, exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once, and found Alaric beside her, watching her with an expression she'd never once seen described in 400 pages of a novel that had gotten almost everything about this man wrong. "You could have let Marrow's fear work against you," he said quietly. "Most people, cornered like that, panic instead of noticing the one thread that unravels everything." "I've had a great deal of practice noticing things other people miss," Isolde said, and meant it more truly than he could possibly know. "It's a useful skill when everyone around you has already decided who you are before you've said a single word." "And who are you, Lady Vantress?" Alaric asked, quieter now, the courtyard emptied, just the two of them and the dying embers of a fire that had been meant to destroy her and instead had only revealed the truth. "Not the woman my Chancellor described. Not the woman your sister wanted the court to see. Who are you when no one else is deciding it for you?" Isolde considered the question honestly, perhaps for the first time since she'd woken into a body and a story that had never truly been her own. "Someone who stopped waiting to be saved," she said finally, "and decided to do the saving herself. I didn't come here to steal a crown, Your Majesty. I came here to survive a story that had already written my death, and somewhere along the way, I found something worth surviving for that has nothing to do with the crown at all." She looked up at him, steady, unflinching, the ice in her voice finally, quietly, thawing into something neither of them had a name for yet. "Whatever this is between us now, I'd like the chance to find out what it becomes, on our own terms, written by no one but ourselves." Alaric reached for her hand, not for ceremony, not for the watching eyes of a court that had finally truly seen her, but simply because he wanted to, and for the first time since arriving in this world, Isolde Vantress let herself believe that some stories could be rewritten entirely not by fate, not by a crown, but by the quiet, deliberate choice to fight for a different ending than the one she'd been given. The Villainess had been meant to die at dawn, alone and hated, on the page of a story that was never truly hers to begin with. Instead, she stood in the last dark hour before sunrise, hand in hand with the very heart she'd once believed she would have to steal, and understood at last that she had never needed to steal it at all. She had simply needed to be seen fully, by someone willing to look past the story long enough to find her.